All right, hey Hannah, I'm here with your aims, which I've just read, and I'm going to give you some feedback. As if I were your PhD advisor, and this was your grant you wanted to write, for your dissertation or something. So I'm just going to give you the feedback that, to make it as strong as it can be. So I like this area of affordances and body stuff, and how that relates to perception and schizophrenia. I think it is understudied. I think I sort of have two things to say. One is try to maybe streamline a little bit, simplify it a little bit so that you're essentially talking about action feedback and affordance perception both in this proposal, and I would probably try to make it just about affordance perception if you really think that hasn't been studied. Because action feedback is a whole nother can of worms. Changing your perception based on movement it's a whole nother thing, versus just judging what can my body do in this environment that I find myself in right now. That would be seems like a more simple place to start. That's probably what I recommend. So for example, get rid of aim 2, and aim 1 can stay. Get rid of aim 2. Aim 3 I would change to be examine the connection between disembodiment and affordance perception, rather than between disembodiment and action feedback. If you wanted to, you could kind of drop the affordance stuff and make it about action feedback, and have aim 2 be to look at the connection between disembodiment, which I'm assuming you can measure using some questionnaire, and the action feedback in schizophrenia. That would be fine. I would just kind of go with one or the other. To me, affordance perception made more sense as sort of like an aspect of perception, and there's been a lot of studies showing altered perception in schizophrenia, so you're going to do another one called affordance perception. It sort of has a twist to it, or a different flavor to it than the other forms of perception that have been studied, but it's sort of extending that literature. Whereas if you do the action feedback thing, it's more you're out in the middle of nowhere, less connected to the existing literature. Of course, I just mean less connected to the existing literature that I'm aware of. There may be a bunch of studies on action feedback in schizophrenia that I'm unaware of. There is one study which you should look up. So that's my main piece of feedback, is kind of go with one or the other of those, affordances or action feedback. Probably just have two aims. The first one is saying, is that thing messed up? Aim 2 is that thing connected to disembodiment? Boom, you're done. The other thing is you should look up the Yu Chen study that I did with Yu Chen on action body stuff. So there's sort of like, I think you would end up citing this paper probably, and it might give you some ideas. It was a study that we did with a touch screen, and so we were interested in, what do they say? What do they say they perceive? That's sort of the verbal cognitive system, perceptual system, but then there's another system that guides our actions, or it's another level of perception. And so then we said, what do they do with their hands? If they have to choose how big something is or move their hand somewhere, how does that look as compared to what they say? And I forget what we found, so it'll be fun for me to potentially have you explain that in your background. But it could be something to mention. I think it came out in 2000, well, I don't know when it came out. I think it was in the Journal of Neuroscience, though. Just called, not, actually, so there's Journal of Neuroscience. That's the name of a journal. That is not the journal that I'm talking about. I'm talking about the Journal Neuroscience. The name is Neuroscience. I think that's the one it was in. Schizophrenia patients show augmented spatial frame illusion for visual and visual motor tasks. Check that out and see if it's relevant, if you can connect that anywhere. So that's most of the feedback I have for you. A couple other little things. The delusions thing, it felt a little weird for you to bring up in the fourth sentence there. Delusions cause an altered perception of reality and impact an individual's view of the world around them, contributing to a distorted sense of self. I mean, sure, delusions are an altered perception of reality. They don't cause an altered perception of reality. So I just felt that sentence was weird. You may be able to drop that. But if you want to get at something about a sense of self, and if that's related to your stuff, then maybe keep it, but abbreviate it and kind of address that weird feeling I had that I just mentioned. Towards the end of the paragraph, with an abnormality in comprehending bodily movement. You don't need to say in the present world. You can drop that clause because there is no bodily movement other than in the present world. Affordance perception found in those with schizophrenia. Oh, extending beyond general deficits in reward learning and reinforcement center of the brain. Yeah, I would connect it less to the reward learning literature and more to the perception literature, maybe. It just felt a little weird that you were bringing up reward learning and reinforcement of all things. You know, a lot of things are messed up in schizophrenia. Why did you mention those two? And also not provide any references for them. So maybe you could leave that, find a reference for that, and also add, like, extending beyond already shown deficits in schizophrenia, including reward learning. Visual perception, you know, you can cite a Yu Chen paper, perhaps the 1999 PNAS paper that I had you guys read in class, and cite the Holtzman paper, you know, eye tracking. That might be a good menagerie. Okay. Let's see, getting into your second paragraph. The action and perception connection can be understood through the concept of a continuous feedback loop with a higher quantity of research on why perception informs action. Yeah, okay. Fine. Therefore, it's still vague whether action informs perception. I don't think that's true. It's not. It's known that action informs perception. You can cite Gibson on that. He wrote a famous book, this guy, James Gibson, on how action informs perception. He wrote it in like the 40s or 50s or something. It's a very influential book. It's probably not known whether action informing perception is messed up in schizophrenia as much. When you start talking about this Franchak study and the study exploring whether action performance facilitates affordance perception, action performance is found to provide feedback on the consequences of performing the action, I felt a little like, what the heck is she talking about? And I wished you were more specific about the task there. So when you say, maybe you could describe what the action was, what the perception was in that task, to help the reader kind of get what you're saying a little more. Since you're cutting an aim, you'll have room to do that. You sort of seem to be making a mistake a lot of people make, whereas you're appealing to the brain as like a source of meaning or something. So in the second to last sentence in that second paragraph, identifying a deficit in action feedback is important, as a lack of action feedback may relate to irregularities in the medial prefrontal cortex. So you're like, hey, it's important to understand this because it could be related to the brain. Well, no, that's not a good point. Because every perception, every percept that everyone has, every action everyone makes is obviously involves some symphony of neural activity. That's the only way we ever move or perceive anything, because our brain is doing something. So saying, oh, it's important because it could be related to this part of the brain, that doesn't make sense to me. Maybe you think the medial prefrontal cortex is especially important or something. I don't know. I just don't really think you need to bring up the brain that much. stick to your guns if you think I'm wrong, but maybe try to clarify what you're thinking a little more if you do want to do that. All right, that's all the feedback I'm going to give you for now. So you're on a good track, as we discussed, and yeah, there's some more work to do to clarify, but keep up the good work.